Hello, and welcome to the Brazilian Report's live discussion on today's September 7 protest. I'm Euan Marshall, the editor of the Brazilian Report, and I'm in São Paulo. And Feliz Dia da Independência to all of the Brazilians watching, and a very good evening to the rest of you. So, what was meant to be a momentous day in Brazilian history turned out to be, pretty interesting. And I think today's events are hardly a game changer, but they certainly will go down in the history of the Jair Bolsonaro presidency. So if you've slept all the way through from yesterday and are just joining us now, wondering what the hell we're talking about, Brazil's far-right president, Jair Bolsonaro, called for mass protests today on the 199th anniversary of Brazil's independence. And while these demonstrations were nominally to preserve the freedom of the Brazilian people, the real target was the Supreme Court and factions of Congress. Now, big demos were planned in Brasília, the capital, and in São Paulo, Brazil's biggest city, and they had a pretty reasonable turnout. Police in Brasília estimated 400,000 people marching on the capital, while the organisers themselves went for the much more conservative 150,000. And police figures in São Paulo estimated 125,000 people on the streets of Paulista Avenue in the biggest city in Brazil. So, big numbers, but still way below what the government was expecting. So, to break down today's events, I'm joined by Brazilian Report Editor-in-Chief, Gustavo Ribeiro, who's in Brasília. Say hello, Gustavo.
Hello, thanks for calling me, Euan.
Excellent. And we're also delighted to welcome a special guest, our very own Dr. Rey, but not that Dr. Rey. It's Beatriz Rey, the NSF Agora Visiting Fellow at Johns Hopkins University, and she's a columnist at the Brazilian Report, and she happens to be in Washington, D.C. right at this minute. Great to speak to you, Beatriz.
Hi, Euan. Thanks for having me. I'm excited for the conversation.
Lovely. So let's kick off with the questions that everyone has been asking themselves. Was this protest a triumph for the Brazilian government, or was it more of a flop? I'm going to go to Gustavo here because you were actually at the protest in Brasília. Tell us, what did you make of it?
Well, for me, it was one of the biggest crowds I've seen in protests in Brasília in person. It was certainly not the biggest, but they were quite sizable. And one thing that is interesting is that in the lead up to this event, we were all expecting a situation in the sort of do or die for Bolsonaro, either a massive turnout that would enable him to be even more radical than he's at the moment, and going beyond words in his attacks to the Supreme Court. There was gossip in Brasília that he was planning a sort of decree to impeach Supreme Court justices, and which is, of course, totally illegal. But if he could have felt enabled by a massive turnout. On the other probability was a major flop and very little crowds that would essentially kill his administration 1.5 years before the end of his term. And I think we got to a point, to a middle ground. It was neither a triumph nor a massive flop. These crowds were big enough for Bolsonaro to remain at the center of the political arena and to continue creating havoc in the Brazilian political system, but not strong enough to maybe topple democracy or maybe do something more drastic, as he hints all the time that he wants to.
And so, what did you see on the streets then? What were the kind of makeup? What was the crowds? What kind of demographics are we talking here? And in terms of the estimates that we've seen, I mean, we've seen the military police in the federal district suggesting that there were 400,000 people there. And we've seen the organizers themselves say there was 150,000 people there. Where do you think the truth lies?
Well, I think 150 might be closer to the actual numbers. The makeup of this crowd was very varied. It was quite varied. We had families, kids, people bringing their pets, everyone in yellow, green, and blue, the colors of the Brazilian flag. We also had a massive turnout by people in the agricultural sector. We had trucks. We had people with barbecue stands distributing meat to everyone to, a way of doing the advertising for the Brazilian meat industry. We had from people who thought they were there just to support the leader they believe, but also extremists who were ready to commit violence on his behalf. There were people who said that they were quite disappointed that Bolsonaro was not driving riot trucks in order to seize the Supreme Court building in Congress. So we had a little bit of everything there.
And Beatriz, going on to Bolsonaro's speech itself, he said, not only in his speech in Brasília, but also again in São Paulo, he suggested that, I can just pull up the quote here, that, he essentially said that he might disobey rulings by the Supreme Court if he thinks that those rulings are, quote, unconstitutional. So, what happens if Bolsonaro does something like that? What happens if he goes against the Supreme Court?
Well, we're in the middle of an institutional crisis already, and what the president is trying to do is to escalate that crisis even further. I was just, before the live started, I shared with Gustavo, apparently he's also trying to ask the Minister of Justice to allow police officers to not abide by decisions if he or somebody considers them unconstitutional. So he's really trying to push the rope very, very far. I think today the two speeches, but particularly the one in São Paulo, were very damaging to Brazilian democracy. I am very worried. And I think right now it's really the time that we should be denouncing his anti-democratic stances in outbursts like it happened today.
But if I may, a lot of people have been denouncing his anti-democratic moves for 2.5 years right now, and that doesn't change an iota of what he does. So how should political actors react to what we saw today? Because as we were talking last week in our Explaining Brazil podcast, right now, everyone in the political establishment is kind of paralyzed by the fear that if they do something, they could propel Bolsonaro to do the proverbial crossing of the Rubicon. I mean, one could argue that he has crossed the Rubicon on many occasions, but so how must the Supreme Court react or Congress react? Because as of now, it has been reported that Supreme Court justices are convening at this moment to decide what they're going to do.
Well, so the literature in political science is not as big as we would want it to be about this topic in terms of just what should the opposition do in a situation that you have a president that is clearly anti-democratic and then it's pushing for what we call an executive aggrandizement, which is basically he's really trying to eat democracy from inside out, right? That's what Bolsonaro is trying to do on a daily basis. Well, we do know there are some works that talk about just how radical responses to these types of presidents, to these types of executives are not always the best solution because it really pushes the president to do something worse and causes democratic breakdown. So one piece of work argues for moderate responses that involve reinforcing the rule of law and reinforcing democratic norms. The problem is in Brazil, we have been doing that to a certain extent. I think the problem to me right now seems to be that Congress is completely absent from this opposition. We have a few opposition voices in both the House and the Senate, but we don't have Congress as an institution trying to stop the president. And I think that's something that we need to do better. And for that to happen, what the literature also says is that we have to have more civil society demonstrations against Bolsonaro. And that can help move congressmen, move parliamentarians to actually embrace the movement to stop him. And I think the opposition is organizing itself. We have protests already scheduled for soon, but we need more, and we need more people out. And I know that the problem really is that we're in the middle of a pandemic, right? So it's hard for people to go out, but that's what we need to make Congress to do its job, right?
Yeah, no, when you speak about the pandemic, it was quite scary doing this demonstration in Brasília because there were very few people wearing masks. I mean, I'm fully vaccinated and I was wearing 2 masks, but still it was a very unnerving time to be there because I tried to mingle in the crowd, speak to people, so masks were very scarce there. And there were reports of journalists that were forced to remove their masks in order to prove that they were not anti-Bolsonaro and that they were not anti-patriotic. But when you talk about mild or moderate reactions, I mean, I would argue we haven't been doing that because outside of a few angry statements, Congress has not been doing anything, and the Supreme Court has only started to kind of draw a line in the sand. But do you think it's already too late? I mean, we are in a situation where moderate responses might not have any effect, but drastic responses, like you said, may push Bolsonaro even further in his radicalization.
Yes, I think we're in a very complicated situation, mainly because the other 2 branches, and especially Congress, has not been doing its job of checking the president, right? I think the vacuum of power there in terms of Congress doing its job to stop him it's really damaging Brazilian democracy. I think the problem, Gustavo, and the literature also talks a lot about this, is we have a lot of uncertainty in this situation. When you have a president like that is trying to subvert democratic institutions, all political actors are going to deal necessarily with uncertainty. And this uncertainty is not only about what the president will do, but also about how the opposition itself is going to behave. Because when we talk about the opposition, we're talking about this black box entity, right? But we know that we have people in Congress, we have civil society, we have a lot of actors that do not necessarily have the same preferences, the same goals, that do not necessarily have the same access to information. So how do you coordinate all these people to make a united front, and a front that can also be creative, which is something else that the academics talk about, to be creative and united to face Bolsonaro? It is very hard. And again, I'm sorry, I'm saying this over and over again, but the Congress could be a fundamental actor in this sense, and it's not doing its job.
Okay, well, so you mentioned there, Beatriz, you mentioned about the 2 speeches that Jair Bolsonaro made. In particular emphasis put on the second speech made in São Paulo on Avenida Paulista. And I'd just like to kind of come on to that protest a little bit just now, because I think almost there's a different analysis to be had of that particular protest in comparison to Brasilia. Because, you know, in Brasilia, it is Independence Day today. There's all sorts of celebrations. Brasilia itself is a planned city, which is not necessarily conducive to mass protest. And as we actually saw with a lot of these kind of aerial images of the protest, it's almost like you could put like 3 million people in there and it would still look a bit empty. But in São Paulo, there was a different strategy. It was more like, let's try and bring in as many people. Let's make that a hub for the kind of southeast of Brazil almost. Bring people from other cities in the state of São Paulo and from other states. I spoke to a lot of people who were at the demonstrations today, and one thing that really came out was that there was a lot of out-of-towners there. You know, it was the conversations they were overhearing were more like, oh yeah, so where did you come from? Oh, how long did it take you to get here? How did you get in? All that sort of thing. And even just kind of walking around my neighborhood as well in São Paulo, just a lot of emblems and symbols that there were a lot of people who were arriving from outside of São Paulo for that. And it's interesting that what we saw in a lot of other state capitals in Brazil, because a lot of these big protests are usually have this style of, let's have a couple of big protests, but also decent sized protests in almost every state capital. That seems to be the strategy. Today, that wasn't really the case. There was a rather big demonstration in Rio. I heard that there were some crowds in Belo Horizonte, some crowds in Maceió, but beyond that, that doesn't seem to be the strategy. The idea was more of, let's concentrate these groups as much as we can in 2 cities and try to, make the biggest show of strength possible. But in the end, do you think that strategy paid off? Because if we look at the numbers for those 2 protests, that's, it's way off what the government were really planning to bring out in terms of national mobilization. So, what do you guys think of that? Do you think that was a smart strategy, or is the best way to do it just everyone all over the country having their own marches, and you add it all up at the end, and it turned out to be 3 million? What do you think?
Can I go first?
Go ahead.
I think what the government wanted, what Bolsonaro wanted, was to demonstrate power, and a big amount of power. And I think from his perspective, it was successful, because we have to understand that this government, it doesn't really matter for Bolsonaro how many people were there, as long as he can take a picture that shows a minimal amount of people gathering and being around him. He's going to do whatever he wants with that particular picture, right? This is a president that does really not rely on the truth, on facts to strategize. So I think they wanted a big mass of people and concentrated in one place. And they got that in São Paulo particularly, not so much in Brasília, but in São Paulo, I think they did. And from that perspective, he was successful. It was a successful strategy, because then he can get the picture that he said he's going to take to the council and do whatever he wants with that. I don't know if Gustavo has the same perception, but that's how I saw all this movement of the agribusiness and evangelicals. And I also have a question for Gustavo about the evangelicals, or you, because I haven't been able to assess whether they were there as much as we expected them to be. But that's why you see this movement of trying to bring people to one place. That's what they wanted, to demonstrate that amount of power.
Yeah, no, the evangelicals were not that present in Brasília. There were very few and scarce. I did see 3 people who were praying in a sort of trance to free the Supreme Court from evil spirits. But outside of these sort of anecdotal cases, they were not nearly as present as agricultural representatives were. And I do agree. I think Bolsonaro did get the photo he was hoping for. I think we're seeing in Twitter sphere a lot of people jumping the gun by saying this is a flop, and not coincidentally, these are people who are not fond of Bolsonaro. So I think that this kind of analysis is also contaminated by wishful thinking and by their own cognitive bias. I think that Bolsonaro, of course, was not as successful as he would hope for. But yes, the good pictures are there, and especially because how this will, the repercussion of this with voters. We also have to take in consideration what Beatriz said earlier about the access to information, about where people get their news from. And social media plays a bigger and bigger role in that. So a lot of people will just have access to the photos that give the impression of huge, massive crowds, and might be inclined to believe that these protests were more consequential than they actually were.
Can I add something to that? I think going to Gustavo's point about how people are saying, the protests were not as massive as Bolsonaro was expecting. I think that's very problematic for us to say that, because we cannot just dismiss the fact that we're a lot of people in the streets today asking for authoritarian practices in institutions. We can't just dismiss that, right? Yeah, it might have not have been as massive as he expected to, but there were a lot of people there to support his authoritarian maneuvers. So we have to accept that. So if we're going to try to oppose him, the first thing we need to do is accept that that's what happened today, even if it wasn't as massive.
And to your point also, the counter protests, these were major flops. I mean, these were very poorly organized. It did not work. What kind of message do you both think that this sends, and in how people will frame September the 7th, and how the oppositions will act from here on?
Well, I think if I can just jump in on that question, in terms of the kind of the opposition protest, I think we have to kind of perhaps even cut a little bit of slack for this particular incident, because this was one that was, it was more organized in opposition to the September 7th pro-Bolsonaro protest. It was more of an idea of, we have to show face, we have to be out on the street. So when you do something like that, I don't think you're ever really expecting kind of a mass planned broad engagement in several different places around the country. It definitely was, I think, underwhelming for the opposition. Although there were a few instances even in São Paulo, by the end of the day, the protest at Válido Anhangabaú actually kind of picked up quite a bit, apparently. And some instances in Recife and Rio de Janeiro, which, there's a bit of positivity there. But I think now the real thing that the opposition has to do is kind of sit down and plan their own proper response to this. Something which would, almost emulate this idea of, right, we're going to get as many people as we can in Brasília. We're going to fill Avenida Paulista. Now's the right time to do it. As long as the coronavirus restrictions and these kind of safety measures that one can adopt themselves, as long as people are abiding by that, I think that it's definitely possible that the opposition could come back to something. But it's something we've seen for the last few years. The right wing in Brazil, and specifically the kind of Bolsonaro core, have been much better at engaging their supporters to come out on the street and just do an old-fashioned protest and show numbers and get, as Beatriz was saying, the photos that we need. Because at the end of the day, it all comes down to what you see on social media and what you can show people in Congress and what you can show, Supreme Court justices and say, oh, look at this, look how many people were there. They're all against you and they're with me. So that sort of idea. But yeah, I think definitely the opposition lacks an organizational capacity. Perhaps now with the relative improvement of the pandemic situation in Brazil, we might see some sort of surge of organization, but we'll have to wait and see.
Beatriz, before you jump in, if I can add one extra question for you, because one additional problem, one additional hurdle for the oppositions to engage, get massive crowds on the streets, is the fact that we cannot say the opposition, but multiple oppositions. We have the left, we have the center right, pretty much everything that is not the far right is currently in the opposition to Bolsonaro, but the right-wing people do not want to demonstrate side by side with the left-wing people because they don't want their mobilization to be misconstrued as any sort of support for former President Lula. There's a lot of resistance within the left to go side by side with right-wingers who impeached Dilma Rousseff, which the left considers a coup. And so how something's got to give if they're going to stage this, if civil society is going to stage this protest. You said earlier that they must in order to counter Bolsonaro. Who's going to give?
That's a very good question. I think I would be very rich if I knew the answer to that right now. I think I'll go back to what I just said. And I think I'll go back to also I think that was the last column I wrote for the Present Report, in which I say that the political elites have to accept that we cannot moderate Bolsonaro. That is a myth, right? We have been waiting since his election for him to moderate his speech and his behavior. And what we've been observing is the opposite. He's increasingly escalating his authoritarian behavior. So before we try to form any coalition within the different oppositions, what we need is to first accept that and accept that that's the common goal. And I don't think that we have passed that. I think there are still some people in Congress, for instance, from some of these center parties that believe that he will, that's only things that he says to mobilize his supporters. That's not actually what he will do. So I think there is a first stage that we need to go through, that is to accept that he will not moderate his behavior, that he is interested in staying in power, that he has been saying that, he has been giving every indication that that's what he wants to do. And then we can start, because once we acknowledge that, the gravity of that, then I think people will be able to put aside some of their own goals to try to combine into some sort of coalition. And that might be naive, right? I think we're in a very polarized environment in Brazil. We're still dealing with a lot of anti-workers' party sentiment, a lot of anti-corruption sentiment. So all of these things are going to be on the table when we're having a conversation about how to form a group that will be able to stop him. But I agree with you on 100%. I think we have to mobilize. We have to put people on the streets. If we don't do that, the message that's gonna after this September 7th is that he was able to put some people, not as much as he wanted, but they were there. There are pictures. He can use them. So we need to. The opposition needs to. When I say we, I'm thinking abstractively, right? But the opposition needs to organize to be able to do that. Otherwise, it's just his narrative that will prevail.
And you mentioned that we must acknowledge and we must come to terms with the fact that Bolsonaro will never be moderate. He only has token gestures of moderation, and then 2 or 3 days, 1 week later, he will lash even further. He will move the goalposts a little bit further, or the goalposts of what is acceptable in Brazilian democracy. But there's an additional pickle, is the fact that, okay, let's assume Congress decides to impeach him and does it. It doesn't mean we're going to have a Democrat as head of state, because Vice President Hamilton Mourão, in 2017, he was calling for a military intervention, which is a Brazilian dog whistle term for coup d'etat. And he was side by side with Bolsonaro in Brasília today.
And that's something I'd just like to bring up quickly, because in response to these protests today, we have seen, I think, well, for me personally, it's quite a surprising amount of mentions right away from parties and political actors of impeachment. This thing that we thought was now impossible. There wasn't enough time to do it. It was dead and buried. There was no chance Bolsonaro could get impeached anymore. But we have several parties suggesting that this is something that we want to do. Individual politicians, everyone just mentioning the I word all of a sudden. Is it possible? Is there time? Is there the broad will to do it? And why now? Do they think that there wasn't enough people out on the streets? Do they think that wasn't a show of support, show of strength? I ask you guys.
Or they think that the tone was too much. That's also possible, especially the second speech. He was very clear in that second speech about not obeying to any orders that comes from the Supreme Court. I think that was, if anybody believed that he hadn't crossed the Rubicon, I think they should start believing after that speech today. I don't know, Gustavo, do you want to share your thoughts, and I'll jump after you?
I'm much less optimistic about believing that we're going to have parties that will actually do what they are supposed to do, which is, if you're in the opposition, oppose the government. I actually do believe that, for instance, this impeachment talk was very much present within the Brazilian Social Democracy Party, which is a center-right party that was at the center of the Dilma Rousseff impeachment, and has kind of flirted back and forth, gone back and forth between neutrality and joining Bolsonaro. For one, the caucus, the PSDB caucus in the House, is controlled by Aécio Neves, a former runner-up in the presidential election, and he is pro-Bolsonaro to the bone. And he controls the caucus, so I do not believe they will actually move forward. I think it's more of an electoral game to say, we're conservative, but we're not radical as Bolsonaro, so keep that in mind in 2022 in order to vote for us. I don't think there has never been shortage of reasons to impeach Bolsonaro. I think he commits an impeachable offense almost every day.
Waking up in the morning.
And so I don't see, and there's another point. There's only one individual in Brazil who can open these impeachment proceedings, and it's House Speaker Arthur Lira. Having a president that is not very strong on his own gives him a lot of leverage to negotiate budgetary amendments, nominations to the government executive positions. I mean, if we had any other president, most probably Arthur Lira would not have the position he has today. He would not have the power he has today, and he will not have the access to the budget, the national budget that he has through the people he nominates to key positions that have big contracts, that have a lot of electoral visibility. So there's also a lot of self-interest in Arthur Lira by not keeping Bolsonaro in check.
Well, I will disagree with one point of what you said, that he wouldn't have that much power in any other government. I think that he could have, because Congress has been getting stronger. Secret budget aside, I think there has been a process of strengthening legislative institutions. The problem is what you said, that he's really benefiting from the system, and he has no interest in acting against that. Arthur Lira was a congressman who he's known in the House by just like the guy who only thinks about himself, right? This is his reputation. He's very self-interest. And I saw that besides the PSDB, but apparently the big center parties are also consulting their ranks about whether there would be interest in impeachment. I'll only believe it when I see it, because even if there is, they have to convince Arthur Lira to actually accept the request, which right now I don't see. Did he even say anything today about the protests? I haven't heard from him.
No, he has been the biggest absence of the day.
Yeah.
Nobody has heard from him.
Has Rodrigo Pacheco said anything? No.
I didn't say, only because Bolsonaro at one point, he said he would call the Council of the Republic, which is like this body that can only be summed when we're discussing a stage of emergency or of a state of defense, something very drastic. And he only said, I was never informed about this kind of meeting. But no.
Yeah. There's something I wanted to kind of touch on here, a kind of a slightly different subject. In the weeks leading up to this protest, or both of these protests, I think there was a lot of kind of media reaction and kind of the kind of Twitter commentators and political pundits kind of suggesting that there was a genuine risk of, potentially a power grab, some sort of, democratic rupture, a coup or violence at least, or even things like, storming the Supreme Court. There was almost this kind of fear and maybe expectation among some people that we would actually see something like that. And, we didn't. There was no coup. There was some violence. There was some restricted violence, but, definitely not what a lot of people were expecting. The Supreme Court was not stormed after all. Who would have thought that? And shortly after Bolsonaro spoke at the Brasília protest, his son, Senator Flávio Bolsonaro, he tweeted out that, oh no, this protest was never anything to do with kind of taking on the Supreme Court or anything to do with democratic rupture. You guys got it wrong, Do you think the media potentially has a bit of, a share of the blame here of getting like a bit carried away, perhaps? Or were we perfectly within the rights to believe that, something like this could happen? interested to hear what you think about this. Either of
Beatriz, you want to go first?
Well, I think that he has been adopting a rhetoric that is very violent, and that he has been threatening the Supreme Court. And the media has been printing that. So if anything, we were misled by Bolsonaro himself, because that's the behavior he has demonstrated so far. I don't see anything that if there is one thing that I think the media did wrong, and I want to ask you both about this too, because I'm very curious now being there, was the role of the military police. That was something that a lot of people said that a lot of the press said, and some researchers said that the military police is pro-Bolsonaro, and they're going to join the protests, they're going to join the demonstrations, and that's going to feed into the whole violence narrative. And I'm not sure the extent to which that happened. Am I wrong?
Well, I do believe that there are a couple of things. One, the media also, researchers published that there is, in terms of political views, yes, the military police is very much pro-Bolsonaro. And there were, to be fair to major outlets, there were colonels and senior military police officers who wanted to join this protest. So I asked myself, at what point did the media coverage taint these things from actually happening? Because we saw in São Paulo, Governor João Dória actually reprimanding some of the officers who were more vocal about it. And Euan was asking about the fact that we didn't have like the invasion of the Bastille or the Supreme Court here.
Yeah. No one touched the Supreme Court.
But I also think that was also because of a strategic mistake made by the protesters, because I think they peaked too early. They started the protest yesterday. They passed through police barricades. And then at that point, everybody was looking at it like, oh, this is a bad omen. Because we saw lots of trucks, pickup trucks, vehicles of people that was in a very radical rhetoric promising to storm the Supreme Court, and the police was doing nothing. There are a couple of things. One, they were very much outnumbered. Maybe they were not prepared for that. But the fact that these wave of people, these throngs of people just pushed the first police line, generated a reaction in political brokers in Brasília. So we had the Chief Justice calling the Brasília governor to have more police officers securing the Supreme Court building. We had everyone on their heels saying, okay, shit's going to get real. We have to prepare ourselves for something. And Amanda Audi, who is one of our Brasília correspondents, she talked to a few fellows who said that their plan was actually to storm the Supreme Court, and they were pissed off because they said, okay, we had a bunch of jackasses who jumped the gun and they screwed everyone's plan. I mean, to what point this is just bravado and to what point this is an actual intent, it's hard to measure. But when we see what was being shared on Telegram groups, when we see what was being shared on social media in general, it's hard to minimize the intent, the violent intent in that. And fortunately, I think they made this mistake, and then they had everyone prepared for the D-Day.
That's an excellent point. So basically, it was their fault.
I think so. Yes.
Well, from what I saw of the kind of the police response, like the official statements coming out after that particular incident where they kind of stormed the Esplanade of Brasília, was that they noted that a lot of these protesters were drunk, intoxicated. They just arrived. They were in a really happy kind of festive mood, and maybe that's what you get for having an open bar on the coach to Brasilia. That might have just ruined the whole thing for them.
I mean, Euan, it was a Monday night in Brasília. There's not that much thing to do outside of opening beer can and having a few seats.
Exactly.
But the risk is not totally gone, because there are a lot of protesters who say they have supplies to stay for at least one more week there, and they plan to stay there and essentially camp in the Esplanade. Beatriz, you were talking, you said several times, you talked about the photograph, the social media photographs. What is the impact of having pro-Bolsonaro people just living between the ministries after this event we saw today?
I really don't know. It depends on how many there are. Do we have an idea of how many would stick? I mean, people get tired of protesting too, no?
Yes.
And let's just remember the current weather conditions in Brasilia as well. Let's hope they have some good air conditioning on hand.
Yes, I don't know. And also, I don't think these are people that are necessarily seasoned in protesting, right? They don't have a lot of experience with protest. Like the indigenous protest that's happening in Brasilia, these are people that are used to, because they come to Brasilia to have their voices heard constantly. But this group, I don't know the extent to which they have experience in protesting. So I don't know if it's just like 6 people camping in the main. I think it's going to be bad for them. If that's the photograph that goes to social media.
Not a great look.
No.
Another thing which I noticed today, and I think most people noticed actually if you were following the protest on social media, was the abundance of signs and placards written in foreign languages. And, this might have been kind of, they were the only ones that were photographed, so they were the only ones that we saw, but, there seems to be an absolute slew of these signs written in English, French, German, lots of spelling mistakes and lots of grammar mistakes, which I think we enjoyed quite a lot. But the what's behind
Macron
that?
Why
Macron with a K? Yeah. Why have we got that? Why now? I know it's always been somewhat of an element of kind of right-wing Bolsonarista protest in Brazil. There has always been some sort of an idea of let's just do some things in English so that maybe Fox News will notice us, something like that. But this seems to be something that was planned. Why do you think?
I think they were trying to project power. That's part of it. Sending a signal to other countries about what's happening in Brazil, that the Supreme Court is taking over everything and that the Supreme Court is to be blamed for every single thing happening in Brazil. I think they're trying to project that, and by putting the signs in other languages, my understanding is that they're trying to project that power that Bolsonaro wanted to project, that they are dialoguing with outside people. I don't know, Gustavo, is that your assessment?
Yes, no, I do. I think that has a lot to do with our straight dog complex in Brazil, that we are validated by foreigners' attentions, and maybe if High sees a sign in Italian, they were like, oh, okay, let's talk to these fellows and see what they have to say to us. So I think there's a lot of that too. But going back to the opposition, just changing the subject a little bit, because this is something that is bugging me for the entire day. This government, this administration, has been characterized by inaction. It chose not to tackle the pandemic. It is doing virtually nothing to tame inflation. It is doing very little to reduce the job crisis, and is doing next to nothing to prevent the water crisis from becoming an energy crisis that will that will put power outages and power rationing in our reality, which will just add insult to injury in terms of this multi-headed crisis we're dealing with. And we were talking about how the opposition should react to what Bolsonaro did today, but how does a government that does not govern derails the job of an opposition? I mean, it's hard because then I read an article at Revista Piauí that has a very interesting point that that almost flips the roles, that it becomes the opposition which proposes policy making and then puts the government in the role of the opposition, which is a very schizophrenic outlook for a political system. But Beatriz, how should opposition groups react when you have a government that simply does not act?
Well, I think it is natural that the opposition is the one doing the policy making, because the administration is it reflects Bolsonaro, and Bolsonaro as the congressman was never interested in lawmaking. So he continues to not be interested in policy making, and he is there just to do the sort of thing he did today. So I think there is no vacuum in power. If he's not doing it, somebody else will do it. So I think it's natural, for instance, that the help that Brazilian citizens got for the pandemic, that was gestated, that was made inside the opposition in Congress. So I think that's a natural development, given that he lacks the interest to do that. And I think that's partly, maybe, now I'm being very naive, but maybe that's why the opposition in Congress has been struggling to be more fearful, because it's taking this load of trying to make policy, whereas there is no guidance from the executive, which is something that is the norm in Brazil. The executive branch, the president, is the one that is the focal point for policy making, and that is not happening. It hasn't happened at all during the Bolsonaro administration. When he tries to do something, everything kabooms before it even gets to Congress. So I think that might be part of the reason that the opposition in Congress, at least, hasn't been that fearful. But I think that they really have to understand the gravity of the situation that we're in. I want to say something that we haven't talked about today, that is, even if we get safe and sound to the 22 election, and even if Bolsonaro loses the election, he has been giving us every signal that he will not accept the results of that election. And is the opposition prepared to deal with that situation? We know how it went here. I don't know. I don't think so. And I go back to Euan's point about how we are still lacking that sort of demonstration that gives, for instance, congressmen the information they need to say, oh, people are unhappy with this government. We need more of that. And we need an opposition that starts to think about what's going to happen once he doesn't accept defeat, if that's what happens. We saw what happened here in the U.S. with President Trump, but the institutions here in the U.S. are more solid than in Brazil.
Well, I think kind of on that point, one of the features, I think, of the Bolsonaro government throughout his time, and you can say this for a lot of other kind of authoritative leaning governments around the world and in history as well, but the messaging to their supporters, their messaging to the press, even their messaging to their opposition is necessarily ambiguous. There's a point made, there's an intention made to kind of muddy the waters and, make everyone second guess themselves. A great example, I think, is what happened today. We had Bolsonaro and a lot of his kind of inner circle talking about these protests and giving these declarations, where it just sounded like, yeah, we're planning to take power here today. We're set for violence today. But at the same time saying that, oh no, these are going to be democratic protests. We're going to obey the rules, and there's not going to be any sort of infringement. And then just at the same time, just constantly feeding this ambiguity throughout the discourse around something like this. And
yeah, like, I don't want to go outside of the constitutional boundaries. But
then
there's always a
you
but.
do in the next sentence. Yeah, exactly. And it's I think the goal of this, and this is something which, I mean, you could even go back to someone like Getúlio Vargas. Getúlio Vargas would do this sort of thing of being really intentionally ambiguous. I believe he said famously, I might be misquoting him here, but he said that I prefer that other people interpret me, as opposed to, you know, I want them to kind of make their own mind up about me, what they think, what they want to do.
But you know, like, this has been going on for how many years now? Isn't it time that the opposition learned that this is the type of communication that we get, and that we can't expect him to behave democratically or to pursue a democratic discourse? Does that make sense? Should we expect any learning throughout the years of his administration?
But I think the lack of learning is also because of the fact that the political establishment continues to underestimate Bolsonaro. And Bolsonaro always proves that betting against him is more often than not a bad bet. I remember in 2017, when I first thought, okay, this guy may be on his way to the presidency, because the way he flipped his discourse, he was known as this homophobic, racist guy, and then he started shifting his messaging by saying, I'm not homophobic, I'm against the dictatorship of gay rights activists. I'm not racist, I'm just for equal opportunity, and racial quotas will screw over white people who are poor and will benefit the few black people who are rich. And by saying that, like, he leaves the position of offense and takes a more defensive, like, I'm protecting our society. And I remember writing in 2017, 6 reasons why Bolsonaro could become president. And I had a business associate at the time who called me to say it was extremely stupid what I had written, and that he would bet me a bottle of whiskey that Bolsonaro would not even crack the 10% mark. I'm still waiting for that bottle, by the way. But but the thing is, like, every time people say, oh, no, but his messaging is not elaborated enough. It's his words will not reason because they're too radical. And they always find a way to rationalize his successes and avoid recognizing his merits. He's an extremely savvy communicator in this hyperconnectivity era, and the political establishment, still has not picked up how to communicate with the masses now, in the social media era, in the end-to-end encryption message era. And the other thing is, like, because they despise Bolsonaro so much, they are never willing to recognize what Bolsonaro is doing correctly to put himself. Which other president will have this kind of economy, over 500,000 coronavirus deaths, and official numbers, the real numbers, almost any expert will say, are much higher than that, and still be able to do what he did today. I mean, we can belittle as much as we want, but it's quite remarkable, his resilience. And the guy is a political Highlander.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a good argument, the fact that he's managed to retain support. But I think the question is, I mean, we've got the election next year. Is it enough? Is that enough? You know, the amount of people that came out on the streets, potentially representing about what, I mean, the opinion polls tend to kind of estimate this at about 20% of the population, 20 to 30% of the population, who they seem to be, you know, die-hard Bolsonaro fans. They'll follow him wherever he goes. They'll come out on the streets whenever they need him, which is a huge bonus for a politician to have, especially one who's running for president. But is that going to be enough anymore? I mean, the opinion polls are saying it's not, but is it?
I don't believe that's the right question. That would be the right question if we were talking about the president who is willing to play by the rules.
Right. I was going to say exactly that.
I'll let you finish the thought then.
No, I think we're going back to the same point over and over again. It is past time the political establishment accepts that he's not going to moderate his behavior, that we should not take him from granted. Like, we should not dismiss him and his supporters. That was a mistake that was done here in the US, and we're doing it in Brazil. We thought Trump could never get elected. Trump was elected. We thought Trump would moderate his behavior once he had a chief of staff. That never happened. So we continue to do the same, to make the same mistake, right? So let's accept that he will not moderate his behavior. Let's accept once and for all that even if he doesn't win the election, he's been telling us that he will not trust any result, that he doesn't count but with his own hands. So he's telling us what's going to happen. I think we have to. How do you guys put the title? Wake up and smell the coffee. That, like, let's do that. We have to accept that if we want to have any conversation about what strategy should the opposition use, so that we can at least understand the context of what the actions that are being taken.
This is what bugs me the most, is that everything he does out in the open. Yeah. If there's one thing we cannot say about Bolsonaro, is that he's not candid about his intentions. He says what he wants to do and he does it, and everybody's like, nah, this is just bravado.
He's not gonna do it. That's for his supporters. It's for Twitter. And that's what
he did, but it was not that bad. It was that bad, but it could be worse. And it's always like this way of trivializing everything Bolsonaro says and does. It's and that is something that really scares me for 2022, because there are 2 months separating election day and inauguration day. If he loses, I mean, let's not forget he has thousands of military officers in his cabinet. There are a lot of people in Brasília who have told us, asking to remain anonymous, that they fear that he could barricade himself in the presidential palace if he loses. So
and I think just on a little point here regarding the kind of comparison between what happened today and the Capitol riots in the US, which is, I think in broad terms it's a fair comparison, because you've got these leaders who are following a similar kind of playbook, and they're pushing for this kind of demonstration under a very tense atmosphere. But I think what we also need to remember is that in the US, that happened under a situation where Trump lost the election, contested the election, but at the same time, it seems to me that the establishment at large were, supporting the election results, that they were willing to defend the election results and say, like, no, like, this is. Whereas Brazil, on the other hand,
I don't know.
In Brazil, it's a lot more.
A lot of the Republican legislators were not supporting the result of the election. But I agree with your point. I don't know what will be the reaction of the establishment at that point. I really don't know. As Gustavo, I'm very scared for what happens after the election, whether he wins or he loses. I'm very scared. And I think Felipe Campanche has been saying this a lot. I think at that point, we can prepare ourselves for violence. There will be violence. The question is just how much.
Okay. On that sobering note, have we got any more? I think we've done just about an hour here. I think we're ready to wrap this up. If anyone has any closing thoughts, or should we just get this over with?
No, I think this last phrase by Beatriz just broke our spirits.
I know.
I'm sorry. I apologize. It has been a long day.
Might have to cut that out. There's children watching. Oh, they are. Anyway, right, guys, thanks very much for joining us here, Beatriz especially. Thanks for taking the time to speak to us and have this lovely little discussion about a very kind of complicated topic. And Gustavo, as always, he came up with the idea as well. So, credits on him. So if you'd like to just say goodbye to the lovely people who are watching us at home.
Bye, everybody. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Euan. Thanks, Beatriz. And we were going to publish this live as our podcast as well this week. So everybody who missed it can rewind and watch back. And Euan, your folks in Scotland will be able to watch this tomorrow as well to see how pretty you look in the video.
Because they're already asleep by now. My mum likes to go to bed around 9 o'clock at the latest. So, right. Thanks, everyone. I'm sure we'll get together soon for another hard-hitting discussion. Thanks a lot. Good night, everyone.